I thought moving in with my son would be a blessing. After 43 years of marriage, I was alone for the first time in my life, and Barnaby's offer felt like a lifeline. I never imagined his wife would see me as a burden, a bill they couldn't afford. The day she told me I was an extra mouth to feed was the day my heart broke into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be mended again. But what she didn't know was that the quiet, grieving widow she was kicking to the curb had a secret that would change everything. And by the time I was done, the only thing locked would be the door to the life they took for granted. If you've ever felt invisible, dismissed, or underestimated because of your age, this story is for you. Please subscribe to this channel because sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when people think you're powerless. My name is Cordelia Whitmore, and this is how I learned that being counted out can be the greatest advantage of all. Harold and I had 43 beautiful years together. We met when I was 22 and he was 24, both of us working at the same insurance company in downtown Hartford. He was an adjuster, I was a filing clerk, and every morning he would find an excuse to walk past my desk just to say good morning. By our third anniversary, we had saved enough for a small house with a garden where I could grow the tomatoes and roses that became my pride and joy. We raised Barnaby in that house, with Harold teaching him to throw a baseball in the backyard while I packed lunches that included handwritten notes of encouragement. Harold worked his way up to senior adjuster, I became an office manager, and we built the kind of steady, loving life that doesn't make headlines, but creates the foundation for everything meaningful. When Harold died of a sudden heart attack last October, just collapsed in our garden while raking autumn leaves, I felt like half of myself had been torn away. The house felt enormous and silent, filled with memories that comforted and haunted me in equal measure. That's when Barnaby called with what seemed like the answer to prayers I hadn't known how to pray. "Mom," he said, his voice gentle with concern, "Imogen and I have been talking. You shouldn't be alone in that big house, dealing with everything by yourself. We have a spare room in our apartment. Why don't you come stay with us for a while, just until you figure out what you want to do next?" I was so grateful, I started crying right there on the phone. The thought of being close to family, of having purpose again by helping with my grandson Rupert, of not facing every evening alone with Harold's empty chair, it felt like a gift I didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Their apartment in the Riverside Manor complex was small but tidy, a two-bedroom unit on the third floor with windows that looked out over a parking lot that wasn't much to see but at least had trees around the edges. Imogen had cleared out what used to be her craft room to make space for my bed, dresser, and the few personal items I'd brought with me. "It's not much," she said with what seemed like genuine warmth, "but we want you to feel at home here." For my first morning in their home, I was determined to be helpful rather than burdensome. I woke at 6 o'clock, the same time I'd been waking for 40 years, and started coffee, began breakfast preparations, and tried to have everything ready before Barnaby left for his job at the accounting firm and Rupert needed to get ready for school. I made Rupert's lunches with the same care I'd once put into Barnaby's, sandwiches cut diagonally because he preferred them that way, apple slices with a tiny container of caramel dip, homemade cookies that I'd baked the night before. I'd include little notes, just like I used to do for Barnaby. "Have a great day at school, sweetheart. Grandma believes in you." While they were gone during the day, I cleaned their apartment with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely cared about creating a comfortable home. I learned that Imogen preferred the bathroom towels folded in thirds rather than halves, that Barnaby liked his dress shirts hung in order from lightest to darkest colors, that Rupert's school papers should be sorted by subject and kept in specific folders. I discovered that Imogen had never learned to cook beyond basic pasta dishes and frozen meals, so I began preparing dinner each evening, pot roasts and meatloaf and chicken casseroles, the kind of hearty, home-cooked meals that Harold and I had always shared. I'd have everything ready when they walked through the door, the table set, the apartment filled with the warm smells of food made with love and attention. I tried to anticipate their needs without being intrusive. When Imogen mentioned that she never had time to organize Rupert's outgrown clothes, I sorted through his closet while she was at work, setting aside items for donation and making sure his current clothes were properly organized. When I noticed that their bathroom grout was getting dingy, I spent an afternoon scrubbing it clean with an old toothbrush. I learned to watch for signals. When Imogen seemed tired after work, I'd make sure dinner was especially comforting and the apartment was particularly quiet. When Barnaby brought home extra paperwork, I'd keep Rupert occupied with games and activities so his father could concentrate. I tried to become invisible when they needed space, useful when they needed help, and always grateful for the privilege of being included in their lives. There were moments when it seemed to be working. Imogen complimented my cooking, Barnaby thanked me for helping with Rupert's homework, and my grandson would curl up next to me on the sofa to read stories before bedtime. I allowed myself to believe that we were building something beautiful together, a multi-generational home where I could contribute wisdom and support while they provided the energy and direction of younger life. But looking back now, I realize that even during those hopeful early weeks, I was trying too hard, working too diligently to prove my worth, walking too carefully around the edges of their established routines. I was so afraid of being seen as a burden that I exhausted myself trying to be indispensable. The changes started small, so small that I told myself I was imagining them. Imogen's "thank you for dinner" became a distracted nod. Her compliments about my cooking turned into comments about how rich the food was, how maybe we should think about lighter options. When I offered to do the grocery shopping, she mentioned that our household expenses were getting higher than expected. The eye rolls began in the third week, when I suggested we watch a different television program, when I asked if Rupert needed help with his science project, when I offered to reorganize their kitchen cabinets to be more efficient. That subtle but unmistakable expression of irritation that made me feel like a child who had suggested something foolish. "Cordelia," she would say, using my first name instead of Mom, the way she had initially, "we have our own way of doing things here. We don't really need..." And then she'd trail off, leaving me to fill in the blank. "We don't really need your suggestions. We don't really need your help. We don't really need you." The comments about money became more frequent and more pointed. "I don't know how single people manage grocery bills," she'd say while putting away the groceries I'd bought, including ingredients for meals I was planning to cook for the family. The electric bill was higher than usual this month. Must be all the extra laundry and longer showers. Each comment delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. Family decisions began happening without me. They would discuss Rupert's weekend plans, vacation possibilities, even what to watch on television, speaking around me as if I were a piece of furniture that couldn't participate in human conversation. When I tried to contribute to these discussions, Imogen would give Barnaby a look, a brief but unmistakable expression of annoyance, that made him change the subject or suddenly remember something he needed to do in another room. Barnaby seemed genuinely unaware of the growing tension, or perhaps he was choosing not to see it. When I tried to mention that Imogen seemed stressed about my presence, he'd wave away my concerns. "She's just adjusting, Mom. It's a big change for all of us. Give it time." But time wasn't healing anything. It was making the atmosphere in that small apartment more suffocating every day. I tried harder. I cleaned more thoroughly, cooked more elaborately, anticipated their needs more carefully. I offered to pay rent, to contribute more significantly to household expenses, to take over more of the childcare responsibilities so Imogen could have more time to herself. But every gesture of helpfulness seemed to irritate her more rather than less. "This was supposed to be temporary, wasn't it?" she said one evening while I was washing dishes after dinner. The question hung in the air like a threat, and when I looked to Barnaby for support, he was suddenly very interested in his newspaper. It was a Sunday evening in late February. I had spent the afternoon preparing shepherd's pie, Harold's favorite recipe, one that had always made our house smell like home and comfort. I used the good china that I'd brought from my own kitchen, set the table with the cloth napkins I'd ironed that morning, even put fresh flowers from the grocery store in a small vase as a centerpiece. We were halfway through dinner when Imogen set down her fork with the deliberate precision of someone who had been rehearsing what came next. The sound of metal against china seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that followed. "Barnaby," she said, not looking at me, speaking as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. "We need to talk about the extra mouth we're feeding here. This isn't a charity, and we can't keep pretending we can afford to support someone who isn't contributing to the household income." I looked across the table at my son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed for, the person I'd trusted to protect me when I was most vulnerable. I didn't say anything, but my eyes were pleading with him to defend me, to remember everything we'd shared, to choose his mother over the woman who was treating me like unwanted furniture. Barnaby stared at his plate as if the pattern on the china held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "Mom," he mumbled without looking up, "maybe it's time. Maybe you should think about other arrangements." I didn't fight. I didn't argue or plead or remind them of everything I'd done, everything I'd given up, everything I'd tried to contribute. I simply nodded, stood up from the table where I'd been sharing a meal made with love and served with hope, and walked to what had been my room for the past 4 months. I packed a single suitcase with the essentials: a few changes of clothes, my medications, the small framed photo of Harold and me on our wedding day. Everything else, the china, the linens, the photo albums, the lifetime of memories I'd brought to share with them, would have to wait. The sound of that apartment door closing behind me was the loudest silence I've ever heard. It was the sound of 43 years of marriage ending, not with Harold's death, but with the rejection of the family I'd thought would help me heal. It was the sound of becoming invisible, unnecessary, expendable. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that the broken, dismissed old woman walking away from their dinner table was about to discover just how much power a person can have when they have absolutely nothing left to lose. The Sleepy Inn Motel on Route 9 became my home for what I thought might be the rest of my life. $47 a night for a room that smelled like industrial disinfectant mixed with decades of other people's disappointments. The carpet was a brown and orange pattern designed to hide stains. The bedspread felt rough against skin that had grown accustomed to the soft linens Harold and I had chosen together. And the bathroom mirror was cracked in a way that split my reflection into fragments, which seemed appropriate for how I felt about myself. I'd sit on that sagging mattress each evening, counting and recounting the money in my wallet. Harold's life insurance had covered the funeral expenses and paid off our mortgage, but what remained in our savings account wasn't substantial. I had maybe 3 months of motel living before I'd have to make more permanent decisions about a future I couldn't envision. The other residents of the Sleepy Inn weren't temporary guests like I'd initially imagined. They were people living lives of quiet desperation. The elderly man in room 12 who'd been there for 2 years after losing his house to medical kills, the middle-aged woman in room 8 who worked 3 part-time jobs but couldn't afford an apartment deposit, the young mother with 2 children who whispered her conversations so her kids wouldn't understand how precarious their situation had become. I felt erased from the world in a way I'd never experienced, not even in the immediate aftermath of Harold's death. At least then, I'd been surrounded by the physical evidence of our shared life: his clothes still hanging in the closet, his coffee cup still sitting by the kitchen sink, his handwriting on notes scattered throughout our home. But in that motel room, I existed without context, without history, without the anchoring presence of anyone who remembered why I mattered. I began to wonder if Imogen had been right. Maybe I was just an extra mouth to feed, a burden that families like mine couldn't afford in today's economy. Maybe expecting your children to care for aging parents was an outdated notion, something from a generation that had different values and different resources. Maybe being discarded was simply the natural consequence of outliving my usefulness. My days developed a routine of purposelessness. I'd wake at 6 out of 40 years of habit, make instant coffee with the room's small electric kettle, and sit by the window watching traffic on Route 9. People driving to jobs and homes and lives that included them. I'd eat meals from the vending machine or walk to the McDonald's 3 blocks away, where the teenage employees began to recognize me as the sad old lady who ordered the same thing every day and sat in the corner booth reading library books to pass time. The silence was the worst part. Harold and I had shared comfortable silences for decades, but this was different. This was the silence of having no one to share anything with, no one who cared about my thoughts or opinions or daily experiences. I'd catch myself starting to say something aloud, forgetting that there was no one there to listen, no one who would respond or care about whatever observation I'd been about to make. On a particularly gray Thursday in March, I realized I needed to retrieve more of my belongings from the storage unit where I'd moved most of my and Harold's possessions before going to live with Barnaby. I'd been avoiding this task because sorting through a lifetime of shared memories felt overwhelming. But I was running out of clothes and needed my heavier coat as winter stretched longer than expected. The storage unit Harold had rented was a 10 by 12 space filled with the physical evidence of our 43 years together, boxes labeled in my careful handwriting, wedding photos, Barnaby's school papers, Christmas decorations, Harold's work documents. I'd been searching through a box marked insurance papers looking for the documentation of our homeowner's policy when my fingers found an envelope I'd never seen before. Inside was a life insurance policy from Pemberton & Associates, the small accounting firm where Harold had worked for his first 8 years out of college before he moved to the larger insurance company where we'd met. The policy was dated 1983, and I stared at it with complete confusion because Harold had never mentioned maintaining life insurance from a job he'd left decades ago. The face value was $200,000, 0 cents, a fortune to us when it had been issued, still a substantial amount now. But more importantly, according to the attached statements, Harold had continued paying the premiums faithfully every year, even after changing jobs, even after taking out the larger policy through his current employer. The beneficiary was listed as Cordelia Ann Whitmore, spouse. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, holding a document that Harold had never mentioned, but had faithfully maintained for 40 years. He'd been protecting me in ways I'd never known, ensuring that even if something happened to him, even if our other resources proved insufficient, I would have the means to take care of myself. The next morning, I called the number on the policy. After providing Harold's death certificate and proof of my identity, I learned that the payout would be $185,000, 0 cents after taxes and fees. The customer service representative explained that the policy had been designed as final expense and widow protection insurance, specifically intended to provide financial security for surviving spouses. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. This wasn't just money. This was Harold's final gift to me, his last act of love and protection. He'd known even 40 years ago that I might someday need resources he couldn't provide from beyond the grave. He'd planned for my independence in ways that even I hadn't understood. But as I sat in that motel room with the insurance paperwork spread across the small table, I realized this discovery meant more than just financial security. It meant I had options. It meant I wasn't powerless. It meant the family who had discarded me as a burden they couldn't afford had severely underestimated the resources of the woman they'd so carelessly thrown away. I began researching the Riverside Manor apartment complex where Barnaby and Imogen lived, not because I wanted to return there, but because I was curious about the building itself, the rental market in that area, the economics of the life they'd claimed they couldn't afford to share with me. What I discovered changed everything. Riverside Manor wasn't a rental complex at all. It was a condominium building where each unit was individually owned. Barnaby and Imogen hadn't been paying rent to a landlord. They'd been paying a mortgage on a property they owned. The extra mouth to feed wasn't a burden on their rental budget. She was a threat to the equity they'd been building in property they'd never mentioned owning. I spent the next 3 days in the public library using their computers to research property records, condominium association bylaws, and real estate market values in their neighborhood. Unit 3B, their apartment, had been purchased for $145,000, 0 cents, 18 months ago. According to recent comparable sales, it was now worth approximately $165,000. But more interesting was Unit 4B, the apartment directly above theirs. It had been on the market for 6 weeks, listed at $168,000, but recently reduced to $159,000. The listing photos showed an identical floor plan to Barnaby's apartment, but with updates they hadn't made. Newer appliances, refinished hardwood floors, a bathroom renovation that looked both modern and elegant. I stared at that computer screen in the library's fluorescent lighting, listening to the quiet sounds of other people researching their own problems and possibilities, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. Power. Not the power to hurt or destroy, but the power to correct a situation that had been profoundly unfair. I didn't want revenge against my son and his wife. Revenge would have been petty, temporary, ultimately unsatisfying. What I wanted was something more substantial. I wanted them to understand the consequences of their choices. I wanted them to experience what it felt like to have their security threatened by someone they'd underestimated. I wanted them to learn that discarding people has costs they hadn't considered. But more than anything, I wanted to reclaim the dignity they'd taken from me. I wanted to transform myself from the unwanted burden they'd discarded into someone who owned something they needed. I wanted to change the power dynamics so completely that they would have to reconsider everything they thought they knew about who had value and who didn't. That evening, back in my motel room, I called Alistair Blackwood, the attorney who had handled Harold's estate. I explained that I'd discovered additional assets and wanted to make a significant purchase, but that I needed the transaction handled discreetly, professionally, and quickly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said after I'd explained what I wanted to do, "that's certainly an unusual approach to real estate investment, but it's perfectly legal and potentially quite sound financially. If you're sure this is what you want to do, I can handle the entire transaction through my office, keeping your identity confidential until closing." I wasn't just buying an apartment. I was buying back my dignity, my security, and my right to exist in the world without apologizing for taking up space. I was buying the power to look my son and his wife in the eye as equals, rather than as someone grateful for their reluctant charity. And I was buying the opportunity to teach them the most important lesson of their lives, that the people you underestimate are often the ones who have the power to change your life completely. The first thing I learned about buying real estate with cash is that it changes everything. When Alistair Blackwood called the listing agent for Unit 4B and mentioned that his client was prepared to make a full-price cash offer with a 10-day closing, the entire tone of the conversation shifted from polite interest to urgent accommodation. "Mrs. Whitmore," Alistair explained during our meeting at his downtown Hartford office, "a cash offer eliminates all the variables that typically complicate real estate transactions. No mortgage contingencies, no loan approval delays, no appraisals that might come in low and derail the purchase. From the seller's perspective, your offer represents certainty in an uncertain market." The owner of Unit 4B was a recently divorced woman who needed to liquidate the property quickly to divide assets with her ex-husband. She'd been showing the apartment for 6 weeks to potential buyers who needed financing, dealing with mortgage pre-approvals and inspection contingencies, and all the complications that come with conventional sales. My cash offer wasn't just attractive, it was the answer to problems she'd been struggling with for months. But timing was crucial for my purposes. I needed to own the apartment above Barnaby and Imogen before they had any idea what was happening. I needed to move through the entire purchase process, offer, acceptance, inspection, closing, while they remained completely unaware that their upstairs neighbor was about to change in ways that would transform their daily lives. Alistair structured the offer through a limited liability company he created specifically for the purchase, Whitmore Properties LLC, which meant my name wouldn't appear on any of the initial paperwork. To anyone reviewing the public records, the buyer would appear to be a small investment company rather than the woman they'd dismissed as a powerless burden. The home inspection was scheduled for a Thursday morning when I knew Barnaby would be at work and Rupert would be at school. I wanted to walk through the apartment, to understand exactly what I was buying and to see firsthand how my investment would position me in relation to the family who had rejected me. The inspector, a thorough man named Nigel Pemberton, spent 3 hours examining every system, every surface, every detail of what would become my new home. Standing in Unit 4B, looking down at the parking lot where I'd seen Barnaby leave for work every morning during my 4 months of living below, I felt a profound sense of rightness. The apartment was beautiful. Hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, a kitchen with granite counters and stainless steel appliances, windows that looked out over mature oak trees rather than just the parking lot. But more than the physical beauty, there was something powerful about being directly above the place where I'd been made to feel unwelcome, where I'd been told I was an extra mouth to feed, where my son had mumbled his agreement that it was time for me to leave. Every room in Unit 4B corresponded to a room below where I'd experienced rejection and dismissal. The inspection revealed that the apartment was in excellent condition, requiring no repairs or improvements before closing. The seller had maintained it beautifully, and the recent updates meant I'd be moving into a space that was not only directly above my former home, but significantly more elegant and comfortable than the cramped quarters where I'd been grudgingly accommodated. The closing was scheduled for April 15th at Alistair's office. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in the navy blue suit I'd worn to Harold's funeral. Not out of morbidity, but because it was the most authoritative outfit I owned, and I wanted to feel every bit of the power this transaction represented. The paperwork took 47 minutes to complete. I signed my name to documents that transferred ownership of Unit 4B from Rebecca Morrison, the divorced seller, to Cordelia Ann Whitmore, the woman who was about to become her former daughter-in-law's upstairs neighbor, and, in a very real sense, landlord. When the attorney handling the seller's side handed me the keys to Unit 4B, I felt the weight of them in my palm like a weapon I'd finally learned how to use. These keys represented more than access to an apartment. They represented my ability to control my own circumstances, to determine where I lived and how I lived, regardless of anyone else's opinion about my value or worthiness. My first stop after leaving the attorney's office was Riverside Manors Management Company, where I introduced myself as the new owner of Unit 4B and requested information about building policies, maintenance procedures, and condominium association bylaws. The property manager, efficient woman named Winifred Ashworth, welcomed me with the professional courtesy reserved for property owners rather than tenants. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, reviewing my ownership documents, "welcome to Riverside Manor. Unit 4B is one of our most desirable apartments, and we're pleased to have you as part of our community. If you need any assistance with the transition or have questions about building policies, please don't hesitate to contact our office." That afternoon, I hired Chapman & Sons locksmith to change all the locks on Unit 4B. I explained that I was a new owner who wanted fresh security, which was entirely true, but not the complete truth. What I really wanted was the symbolic and practical power of being the only person who could access my space. The psychological security of knowing that no one could enter my home without my permission. While the locksmith worked, I coordinated with Riverside Moving and Storage to schedule the delivery of furniture I'd ordered from a local home goods store. Nothing elaborate or expensive, just clean, comfortable pieces that would transform the empty apartment into a home that reflected my taste rather than someone else's grudging accommodation. I chose a dining room table large enough for 6 people, not because I expected to entertain frequently, but because I wanted to own a space where people could gather, where meals could be shared, where I could invite guests if I chose, rather than hoping for invitations that might never come. I selected a comfortable reading chair positioned by the window where I could look out at the trees and feel connected to the natural world that had always brought me peace. The bedroom furniture I chose was elegant but practical. A real wood bed frame, a matching dresser, nightstands that could hold books and medications, and all the personal items that make a space feel like home. This wasn't temporary housing or grudging accommodation. This was my home, purchased with my money, furnished according to my preferences, secured with locks that I alone controlled. But the most profound changes weren't happening in the apartment, they were happening in me. The woman who had packed a single suitcase and accepted dismissal without argument was disappearing, replaced by someone I was still learning to recognize. The morning I woke up in my own apartment for the first time, I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw something I hadn't seen in months: determination. I went shopping for new clothes, not because my old clothes were inadequate, but because I needed outfits that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I had been. I chose pieces with clean lines and confident colors, clothes that made me stand straighter and speak more clearly. I wasn't trying to look younger or different. I was trying to look like myself, the person I'd been before grief and rejection had diminished my sense of worth. My voice changed too. The tentative, apologetic tone I developed during my months of trying not to be a burden was replaced by something clearer, more direct. I found myself speaking with the authority of someone who owned property, who had resources, who had the right to take up space in the world without justifying that existence to anyone. For 43 years, my identity had been built around being Harold's wife, Barnaby's mother, someone whose value came from my relationships to other people. Then, after Harold's death, I tried to rebuild that identity around being a helpful grandmother, a useful addition to my son's household. But now, for the first time in my adult life, I was discovering who Cordelia Whitmore was as an independent person. I learned to manage property ownership, to coordinate with contractors and service providers, to make decisions about my living space based on my preferences rather than other people's tolerance. When the apartment's dishwasher began making unusual noises, I didn't ask anyone's permission to have it repaired. I simply called a service technician and handled the situation myself. There's something profoundly powerful about owning the space where you sleep, where you eat your meals, where you spend your quiet evening hours. It's not just about the financial investment or the legal rights of ownership. It's about the fundamental security of knowing that no one can tell you to leave, no one can make you feel unwelcome in your own home, no one can reduce you to a burden they can't afford to carry. But as satisfying as my new independence was, I knew that the real test was still coming. Barnaby and Imogen had no idea that the extra mouth to feed they'd discarded was now living directly above them, that the powerless old woman who had accepted dismissal without argument was now their neighbor and, in some sense, their superior in the building hierarchy. I spent 2 weeks settling into my new home, establishing routines, making myself comfortable in the space that represented everything I'd reclaimed about my own worth and capabilities. I wanted to be completely secure in my new identity before I revealed myself to the family who had so badly underestimated what I was capable of achieving. The woman they had dismissed as a burden was gone. In her place was someone who owned property, who controlled her own circumstances, who had resources and options and the confidence that comes from proving to yourself that you're stronger than anyone imagined. And now it was time for them to meet the person I'd become. Saturday morning, April 30th. I chose this day deliberately. A weekend morning when Barnaby would be home, when Imogen wouldn't be distracted by work obligations, when Rupert would be there to witness whatever unfolded. I wanted the entire family present for what was about to happen, because this wasn't just about the 2 adults who had dismissed me. This was about showing my grandson that his grandmother was not the powerless burden his parents had described. I woke at 6 o'clock, showered with the expensive lavender soap I'd bought for my new bathroom, and dressed in the charcoal gray wool dress I'd purchased specifically for this occasion. Not funeral black, not apologetic beige, but a color that suggested authority without aggression. I styled my silver hair carefully, applied lipstick for the first time in months, and looked in the mirror at someone who owned the space she occupied. At exactly 9:30, I walked down the single flight of stairs from Unit 4B to Unit 3B, my footsteps echoing in the hallway with a confidence I hadn't felt since Harold's death. In my left hand, I carried a manila folder containing the ownership documents for my apartment. In my right hand, I held the keys to Unit 4B, not just as functional objects, but as symbols of the power I'd reclaimed. I stood outside their door for perhaps 30 seconds, listening to the familiar sounds of Saturday morning in the apartment where I'd once tried so desperately to belong. I could hear Rupert's voice asking about something. Imogen's response, the clatter of breakfast dishes being managed. These were the sounds of the life they'd decided was too crowded to include me. I knocked 3 times, not the tentative tap of someone asking permission, but the firm, measured knock of someone who had legitimate business to conduct. The sound seemed to resonate through the hallway, announcing that something significant was about to happen. The footsteps approaching the door were Imogen's. I recognized the quick, slightly irritated pace of someone who wasn't expecting visitors and wasn't pleased to be interrupted during weekend family time. When the door opened, she was wearing a blue cotton robe over pajamas, her hair still messy from sleep, holding a coffee mug that read, "World's Best Mom." "Can I help you?" she said with the polite but guarded tone people use for strangers at their door. For perhaps 3 seconds, she didn't recognize me. The woman standing in her hallway, confident, well-dressed, clearly there with purpose, didn't match her mental image of the defeated burden she'd dismissed 2 months earlier. Then her eyes widened and the coffee mug trembled slightly in her hand. "Cordelia," she said, her voice rising with disbelief. What are you doing here?" I held up the keys to Unit 4B, letting them catch the hallway light so she couldn't miss their significance. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Some photo albums, china from my mother's set, personal items that I wasn't able to take when I left, so—" Abruptly, "I'm here to collect them." "I don't understand," Imogen said, glancing at the keys in my hand, then back to my face, trying to process information that didn't fit any scenario she'd imagined. You don't live here anymore. You can't just show up and demand things." "You're absolutely right," I said, maintaining the same calm, reasonable tone. "I don't live here anymore. I live upstairs now, Unit 4B. I'm your new neighbor." I paused, letting that information settle. And as someone who now owns property in this building, I have every right to be in this hallway. The color drained from Imogen's face as she processed what I'd just said. You live upstairs. How is that possible? You were staying at that motel. You don't have the money to buy an apartment?" I finished for her. "You're quite wrong about that. Harold left me more resources than I initially realized. Resources that allowed me to purchase Unit 4B for cash, complete with all the renovations and upgrades that make it significantly more valuable than your apartment." That's when Barnaby appeared behind his wife, drawn by the sound of voices and probably sensing the tension in Imogen's posture. When he saw me standing in their hallway, his expression went through the same progression of confusion, recognition, and shock that his wife's had moments before. "Mom?" he said, his voice uncertain, almost childlike. "What is this? What's going on? Imogen said you were— How are you here?" "I'm here because I live here, Barnaby. Unit 4B, directly above the apartment where you told me it was time for me to find other arrangements. I'm here because I own property in this building now, which makes me not just your mother, but your neighbor. And in some sense, given the building's ownership structure, your superior in the condominium association hierarchy." I watched my son's face as he processed this information. The son who had mumbled his agreement when his wife declared me an extra mouth to feed, who had stared at his plate rather than defend the woman who had raised him, who had chosen the path of least resistance over loyalty to family. "The photo albums are in the closet in what used to be my room," I continued, maintaining my businesslike tone. "The china service is packed in boxes in your storage area. I'll need about 30 minutes to collect everything and then I'll be out of your way. I'm sure you'll want to process this new information privately as a family." "This is insane," Barnaby said, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to understand how the power dynamic had shifted so completely. "You can't just buy an apartment to spite us. This is some kind of game, some kind of manipulation." "Spite?" I repeated, allowing a note of steel to enter my voice for the first time. "Barnaby, I bought an apartment because I needed a place to live after being told I was a burden your family couldn't afford. The fact that it's in this building is simply convenient. It means I can keep an eye on my grandson's well-being and be available if he needs anything his parents can't provide." The silence that followed was profound. Both Barnaby and Imogen stood in their doorway, still in their weekend clothes, trying to process the reality that the powerless old woman they'd discarded had not only survived their rejection, but had positioned herself directly above their daily lives, with resources and authority they hadn't imagined she possessed. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the mortgage payments they were struggling with while I had purchased my apartment with cash, the financial stress they'd used to justify my dismissal, while I now owned property more valuable than theirs, the power dynamic that had shifted so completely they didn't yet understand how to navigate their new reality. "I'll give you a few minutes to discuss this privately," I said, stepping back from their doorway. "Then I'll come back for my belongings. We're going to be neighbors for the foreseeable future, so I suggest we all learn to handle this situation with as much dignity as possible." I turned and walked back up the stairs to my apartment, my footsteps echoing in the hallway like the sound of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. Behind me, I heard their door close. Not slam, but close, with the careful deliberation of people who needed to talk about something that had completely upended their understanding of their own lives. For 2 months, they had believed they were rid of me. They thought the extra mouth to feed had been successfully eliminated from their lives, sent away to struggle with problems that were no longer their concern. Instead, I was now permanently positioned directly above them, owning property more valuable than theirs, holding keys that represented security they didn't possess, living proof that their assumptions about my capabilities had been spectacularly wrong. They had thought dismissing me was the end of my story. Instead, it was the beginning of theirs learning who I really was. The changes in their behavior began immediately. Within hours of my revelation, I could hear the muffled sounds of intense conversation through the floor of my apartment, voices rising and falling in the kind of urgent discussion that happens when people realize their world has shifted in ways they don't know how to handle. By Monday morning, their routine had already altered. Barnaby, who used to leave for work at 7:30 with the casual confidence of someone whose home life was settled, now left earlier and returned later. I could hear him on his phone in the parking lot before coming upstairs, conversations that had the strained quality of someone seeking advice about a situation he'd never imagined facing. Imogen's behavior was even more telling. The woman who had declared me an extra mouth to feed now moved through the building common areas with the careful awareness of someone who knows she might encounter a person she'd badly misjudged. When we passed in the hallway, which happened frequently given that I now lived directly above them, she would offer tight, uncomfortable smiles and hurried greetings before quickly disappearing into her apartment. But the most significant changes weren't just between us. Word travels quickly in a building like Riverside Manor, where neighbors know each other's routines and pay attention to unusual developments. Within a week, everyone knew that the elderly woman living in 4B was the mother of the man in 3B, and that there was some kind of family situation that had resulted in very unconventional living arrangements. Winifred Ashworth, the property manager, mentioned during a chance encounter that several residents had commented on what a lovely addition I was to the building. "It's wonderful to have someone who takes such obvious pride in maintaining her property," she said, "and everyone appreciates how you've handled what could have been an awkward family situation with such grace and dignity." The social dynamics in the building shifted in ways that clearly made Barnaby and Imogen uncomfortable. Neighbors who had previously been friendly but casual with them now asked pointed questions about family relationships, made comments about the importance of caring for elderly parents, and generally treated them with the kind of polite distance reserved for people whose character had been found questionable. But beyond the social embarrassment, I began to notice signs that their financial situation was more precarious than they'd wanted to admit. The parking space that had been emptied beside Barnaby's car was suddenly occupied by a smaller, older vehicle, suggesting they'd sold one car to manage expenses. The premium cable service that had always provided background noise in their apartment was apparently discontinued, based on the arguments I could overhear about entertainment options. I I realized that their treatment of me hadn't just been about the inconvenience of an extra person in their small apartment. They had been struggling financially probably since purchasing their condo, and my presence had represented not just additional expenses, but a reminder of their inability to comfortably manage their chosen lifestyle. The extra mouth to feed comment hadn't just been cruel, it had been a reflection of genuine financial anxiety. It was something profoundly appropriate about the fact that their financial stress had led them to reject the family member who turned out to have resources they desperately needed. They had calculated that they couldn't afford to include me in their lives, not realizing that I now owned property more valuable than theirs, and had achieved financial security they clearly lacked. 3 weeks after my revelation, on a Tuesday evening around 8 o'clock, I heard a soft knock at my door. Not the confident knock of someone making demands, but the tentative tap of someone who wasn't sure they deserved to be answered. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Barnaby standing alone in the hallway, his shoulders slumped in a way that reminded me of the little boy who used to come to my room when he'd made mistakes and needed forgiveness. I opened the door to find my son holding a small bouquet of daisies. Not expensive flowers, but the kind I'd always loved, the kind I used to grow in the garden behind the house where I'd raised him. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion or emotion, and when he spoke, his voice had the shaky quality of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for a conversation he wasn't sure he could handle. "Mom," he said, not moving from the doorway, not assuming he would be invited in. "I need to say something, and I need you to listen, even if you don't want to hear it." He took a breath that seemed to require effort. "I chose wrong. When Imogen said you were an extra mouth to feed, when she demanded that you leave, I should have defended you. I should have told her that you were my mother, that you'd sacrificed everything to raise me, that family doesn't abandon family when things get difficult." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened my door wider and gestured for him to come in, not because I was ready to forgive, but because the conversation he was attempting required privacy and dignity. He sat on the edge of my sofa like a guest who wasn't sure he was welcome, holding those daisies as if they might somehow repair 40 years of shared history that had been damaged by one moment of cowardice. "I told myself that keeping peace with Imogen was protecting our family," he continued, his voice becoming stronger as he committed to honesty. "But what I was really doing was protecting my own comfort, avoiding conflict even when that meant sacrificing the most important relationship in my life. I was a coward, Mom. I chose the easy path over the right path, and I lost my mother because I was too weak to stand up to my wife." "Barnaby," I said, accepting the flowers and setting them on my coffee table, "I appreciate your honesty, and I'm glad you've come to understand what happened. But understanding what you did wrong isn't the same as earning forgiveness. Trust, once broken, takes time and consistent action to repair." "I don't expect immediate forgiveness," he said, meeting my eyes for the first time since entering my apartment. "But I want you to know that I've learned something about myself that I don't like, and I want to become the kind of man who deserves to have you as his mother. I want Rupert to see me defend family, to see me choose loyalty over convenience." We talked for 2 hours that evening, the longest conversation we'd had since his father's funeral, not about forgiveness or immediate reconciliation, but about the kind of relationship we might be able to build if he was genuinely committed to changing the patterns that had led to my dismissal. I told him about the loneliness I'd experienced at that motel, about discovering Harold's insurance policy, about the strength I'd found in reclaiming my independence. But I also made it clear that our future relationship would be different from our past one. I would not be returning to the role of grateful dependent, hoping for inclusion in their lives. I was now their neighbor, their equal in property ownership, someone with resources and independence. Any relationship we rebuilt would be between adults who respected each other's autonomy rather than between a parent desperate to belong and a son who felt burdened by that desperation. 6 months after moving into Unit 4B, I can honestly say that being rejected by my son's family was one of the most painful and ultimately transformative experiences of my life. The woman who packed a single suitcase and accepted dismissal without argument no longer exists. In her place is someone who owns her own space, controls her own circumstances, and has learned that self-respect is more valuable than acceptance from people who don't value what you offer. There's a profound difference between being included in someone else's life out of their generosity and building your own life that others might choose to join. For 4 months in their apartment, I had been grateful for whatever attention, whatever kindness, whatever tolerance they were willing to extend. Now, in my own home, I decide who is welcome, who deserves my time, who has earned the privilege of my company. I've learned to enjoy solitude without loneliness, to find satisfaction in my own routines and preferences rather than constantly adapting to other people's needs. I cook meals that I enjoy, read books that interest me, arrange my furniture in ways that please my eye. The space I occupy is completely mine, chosen by me, maintained according to my standards. Barnaby visits now, usually alone, sometimes with Rupert. These visits happen on my terms, when I'm prepared for company, when I choose to open my door, rather than when family obligation demands it. Imogen has not been invited, and I've made it clear that any future relationship with her would require acknowledgement of how badly she misjudged both my character and my resources. But my relationship with Rupert has flourished in ways that wouldn't have been possible when I was living below them as a barely tolerated burden. He comes upstairs after school sometimes, marveling at my apartment with its upgraded appliances and comfortable furniture. We do homework at my dining table, bake cookies in my modern kitchen, and he tells me about his day without the undercurrent of tension that used to characterize our interactions. Every morning, I stand at my kitchen window with my coffee, looking out over the oak trees that frame the parking lot, watching my neighbors begin their days. I see Barnaby leave for work, sometimes glancing up at my window with an expression I can't quite read. I see other residents walking their dogs, heading to jobs, living lives that include me now as a property owner, a neighbor, someone with her own established place in this community. What I've learned is that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you becomes the catalyst for discovering strengths you didn't know you possessed. Being dismissed as an extra mouth to feed forced me to find resources I'd forgotten I had, to develop confidence I'd never needed, to create a life based on my own choices rather than other people's tolerance. If you're someone who has been made to feel like a burden, someone whose contributions have been minimized, or whose presence has been treated as inconvenient, I want you to understand that other people's assessments of your worth are not facts. They are opinions, often based on incomplete information or their own limitations rather than your actual capabilities. The apartment above theirs isn't just a place where I live, it's proof that I survived their rejection, evidence that I'm stronger than they imagined. A daily reminder that being underestimated can be the greatest gift anyone can give you. Because sometimes, when people decide you don't belong in their lives, what they're really doing is freeing you to discover where you actually belong, and that place might be somewhere much better than anything they could have offered you. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been made to feel small, dismissed because of your age, or underestimated because someone mistook kindness for weakness, remember that your story isn't over. Your power isn't gone. It's just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Please subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed hearing about how the quiet old woman they tried to discard turned out to be the most formidable opponent they'd ever encountered. Share your own stories of transformation in the comments below. I'd love to hear about the moments when you discovered you were stronger than anyone imagined. And remember, the people who count you out are usually the ones who have the most to learn about who you really are.